right, if you will, let's come to order and begin our prayer meeting time tonight. So go ahead and find your seat, get your Bibles open, and be ready to go. It's not that I'm going to weary you tonight, at least I hope I don't weary you. I hope that if you're like me, it's kind of like well, every day is a rest day, even though you're working, because I know who I'm resting in, all right? So we want to rejoice in that, but I'm going to take and bring you an address from what James has to say about our situation of having a friend in this world. I want to talk to you out of the passage we're going to look at tonight about that danger of friendship with the world. And James really does help us to identify the danger when he tells us that friendship with the world puts a person in a lot of danger, great danger. Anyone in a state of loving the world is basically seeking its values over those of God. That's something to think about. I think a lot of people in the Christian life do not find things like that as something they want to dwell on. But he does help us identify the danger. Friendship with the world puts a person in great danger. See, anybody who's in a state of loving the world, seeking its values over the values of God, must face the fact that he or she is in very serious danger. And that danger is spelled out by one word that we can remember, and that's the word conflict. Conflict. If we were to define worldliness in one simple way, I would think that James puts his finger on it when he defines worldliness primarily as a conflict. Conflict. It's something to meditate on. I hope you had a good day today. I hope your heart has been rejoicing, and when you have cause to repent over something, you take it to the Lord and you know that God can forgive. But it's kind of different with the world. Have you noticed the conflict in the world? It can't really escape your thinking about it. At every single conceivable level, you have conflict in families, conflict in marriages, conflict in employment, conflict in every area of human existence that escalates ultimately to conflict between nations, where peoples as nations are warring against each other. That's simply the microcosm of the microcosm. Now, I did not say the same word. I said two different words there. The words are macrocosm, and the other word is microcosm. Conflict that exists in the heart of a worldly person. It does. Where does all this come from? All this conflict, all this hatred, all this animosity, all this anger and rage that we see all over the world. You can't get the morning news, the afternoon news, or the evening news without being slapped in the face with some type of bad news. Listen, the world's in pretty bad shape. And I mean, it's in the tiniest little things or the biggest things. I mean, the hostility is absolute mind-boggling. Listen, it shadows everything and shatters everything that man touches. Everything that he touches is literally the victim of his hostilities. Mankind's hostilities, not God's. But that's how it is if you're a friend of the world. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it's wrong to be friendly. I think it's characteristic that God's people, when they meet even the vilest of people, can be friendly toward them. If not, how in the world are you going to win them? It's tough. It's tough. James poses three dimensions of conflict. Let me list them for you. Conflict with others, conflict with self, and conflict with God. And all three of those come out of loving the world. Because the primary issue with the world is a little four-letter word. And you spell that four-letter word S-E-L-F. And when you have a whole world full of people living for themselves, you can have inevitably what? Inevitably, what's going to happen? Conflict. So let's start with the implication that is given in verse 1 of the chapter of James. James says this in chapter 1. Whence come wars and fightings among you? That's the way it is in the original text. In other words, James is saying, where do wars come from? Where do they come from? Where do the battles come from that are among you? By the way, you take that word among you, it's best understood in the context of referred to agitated relationships between people in the church to which James is writing, rather than some internal tension in each individual person. Now, I don't think he's talking about your internal war, your internal fighting. I really think he's talking about conflict in the assembly of the church and serious, continuous conflict. You see, the statement is very pungent because it has no finite verb, which means absolutely nothing to most of you here tonight. Shed should pick up on that. He's got some Greek training in his heart. Maybe you get that. If you don't get me to talk about bad verbs, I'll let you know. All right. It's serious. That statement is pungent because it has no finite verb. He just spits it out without a verb. And because he uses the interrogative verb twice, that's the word whence, W-H-E-N-C-E, whence. It just adds punch. And what's he saying? He says, whence wars? Whence battles among you? How did this happen? Where is this coming from? And he uses the plurals for wars, which is the word polemos. Polemos. That's not Spanish, that's Greek. That word means conflict. And the word wars W-A-R-S, just means a prolonged states of conflict. Then he uses the word for battle. It's the word mach, M-A-C-H, which means a separate fight. So where does this prolonged state of warfare come from? And where do those individual battles that fill up that prolonged state come from? Well, both of these things are expressed in a sense that he puts them in the present tense. Present tense sense, whence come wars and fightings among you? It seems to be a continual condition among these people. And James chooses the violence vocabulary. I'm talking about language. Look at verse 2. Verse 2 says, lust, kill, fight, wage war. He uses some strong language there. He could have chosen any kind of metaphorical vocabulary, but he chooses violence terminology because it expresses the intensity and the destructiveness of the conflict in the church. So I need to remind you that what was happening in this church was conflict, and it was happening because, he would say, because you had some people in the church who are deeply in love with God and other people who are deeply in love with the world. Oh, you didn't want to hear that? Listen. That spells trouble because you have people who love God, who are trying to get along with people who love the world. People whose greatest priority is to glorify God. And then those whose greatest priority is to glorify self. Conflict's inevitable. It's going to happen. So James uses hot conflict terminology. And by the way, conflict in the church is not God's design. Don't blame God for it. Jesus said, I want you to love one another so all men will know that you are my disciples. Jesus said in John 13:34 and 35. Jesus prayed in his high priestly prayer, chapter 17 and verse 21, that his people would love one another and thus would bear his name properly. He wrote to the Corinthians and pleaded with them to be of one mind and have the same opinion and speak the same things and break up these factions. You know, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Cephas, I'm of Christ, and so forth. Paul wrote to the Philippians in chapter 1 and verse 27 and said, listen, this is a quote, I want you to stand fast in one spirit with one mind, striving together for the faith of the gospel. What are we looking for when we have, not only when we preach, but when we have business meetings? What are we looking for? We're looking for a time to fight. You know, I'll take you on, you know, you knock me once, I'll hit you twice. You know, no, we're not like that. We stand fast in the Spirit with one mind. In the second chapter, he says, quote, I want you to have the same love one toward another, being of one accord and one mind. See, unity in the church was greatly on the heart of Jesus Christ. He prayed to his Father that they may be one. In the scriptures, it records that his words that the world may know that you sent me. What's that saying to us? It's saying you ought to have a life that testifies that you belong to God. You can testify that the world can know Jesus Christ if you want to tell them, if they want to listen. And yet, conflict in the church is a real reality. Paul writes to the Corinthians in chapter 3 and says, I can't even speak to you as mature people because you're in such conflict. I mean, such hostility toward one another. Well, why in the world did he write that? Because it happens in the church. In 2 Corinthians, at the end of the epistle in verse 20, the Apostle Paul writes, I fear lest when I come, I'll not find you such as I would, and that I'll be found among you such as would not, and there would be debaters and envying and wrath and strife and backbiting and whispering, conceit and disorders. Because I hate to come and find stuff like that. Paul writes to Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 6 through 10 about the conflict in the church because false teachers holding up false standards were given a platform. It was happening in this Jewish congregation, which James wrote as well. It was happening because, well, you know what's going on in your life. Hot terminology, by the way, of verse 1 and 2 is a fast lane change. Really it is. From the cool terminology of verses 17 and 18 of chapter 3. That sort of sweet, peaceable description of wisdom, pure, peaceable, gentle, so forth and so on. And it explodes in chapter 4 with that kind of wisdom coming from God. Where do all these wars come from? Well, certainly not from the wisdom of God. Not the wisdom that is from above. But rather, these things are definitely indicative. Go back to verse 14. Of bitter envying and strife in your hearts. Of a wisdom that doesn't come from above, but is earthly, sensual, and devilish. And where that envying and strife are, there is confusion in every evil deed. In other words, people, what he's saying is this. You have some people who are claiming to know Christ, but they demonstrate a wisdom that doesn't come from God. You have some people who claim to know Christ, and they demonstrate a wisdom that is from God. Again, I'll say it again. You have some people who claim to know Christ, and they demonstrate a wisdom that's from God. And that's the rest of the test, the rest of the test at the end of chapter 3. And that same test carries on into chapter 4. Where do we find these wars and fightings among you? Certainly not from people whose wisdom is pure and peaceable, easily to be entreated and gentle. The very wars he talks about in chapter 4, verse 1 are evidence of the presence of worldly wisdom in conflict with dealing with wisdom. So, the legacy of conflict is given by two kinds of wisdoms coming together and clashing with each other. Small wonder that there was conflict in the church where the wheat and the tares were mixed, where people who were the friends of God were trying to work with people who were the friends of the world. In the final two verses of James chapter 5, when he wraps up the epistle, the goal of this epistle is to bring people to true salvation, and these are the tests given to awaken them to whether or not it's true. And so he assumes in the first statement of verse 1 that there's conflict with each other. And that's the way it is in loving the world, because every friend of the world, interestingly enough, is an enemy of every other friend in the world in one sense, because you live for self. And anybody who gets in your way is reason for hostility. So inevitably, a friend of the world, a lover of the world, one who sets his affections on the things of the world, will be consumed with his own lust, consumed with his own pride, and he'll be in conflict with the people around him. But I want you to note something a second. Not only does the friendship of the world create conflict to everybody around, because everybody's got his own personal priorities first, but it also generates conflict within the person, within himself. And James quickly moves to that conflict with self. And this is a major thrust of the opening three verses. What James is saying here is the wars and fightings, the external conflict is rising out of an internal conflict. And he describes that conflict as a combination of three things, and I think you'll find this fascinating. It's a combination of three things, so let's look at least at number one. The first thing that generates internal conflict, just think about it for a moment. Do we need somebody to inform us that people in our environment today are having a lot of internal conflict? You know, it's pretty obvious, isn't it? I mean, you look at the proliferation of mental illness, psychologists, psychiatrists, counselors, therapists, psychotherapists, and on and on and on, trying to help people resolve this tremendous conflict. Think of it. Suicide, drunkenness, drugs, all trying to alleviate tremendous internal conflict so that you have conflict on the outside only as a manifestation of a tremendous war that's going on inside. What's that, war? I mean, people battling to fulfill their desires and lust and ambitions, and being thwarted in the process are frustrated internally. They get it both ways, internally and externally. That ultimately translates itself into external hostility against people who stand in their way, or even against themselves in their own inability to bring to pass the things that they want. Look at the question in verse 1. Whence come wars and fightings among you? Come they not hence? And here's the answer to the question. Come they not hence out of your lusts that war in your members, in your hearts? And the form of the question expects a yes answer. In fact, it would be read this way. They come out of your lust that war in your members. There's where they come from. Where does all that external conflict come from? It comes from internal conflict. Again, you might sit there tonight and think, oh, you're playing words with us. I'm trying to be very careful having the right ones to say here. See the word hence, H-E-N-C-E? That's tied to whence. And that gives us the true source of external conflict. Where does it come from? Look what it said. He says it comes out of your what? Your lust. Very interesting word. In the Greek, it's hedon. We get the word hedonist from that Greek word. I don't know if you ever, I'm not talking to unschooled people. I think most of you know that. At least if you hang around here long enough. I mean, have you ever heard of hedonism? Not heathen, hedon. It's simply in our culture, and it means one who lives for pleasure. That's a hedonist. And that's exactly what the word means, having a desire for pleasure. You see, the word is is plural here, and all external conflict in the world rises out of people's tremendous, uncontrollable desire. That's one point. Number one, under conflict with self. See, three things cause conflict internally in people. First of all, is uncontrolled desire. People are driven by their passions, their desires for pleasure. See, the term, in fact, describes the desires for worldly pleasure that are contrary. And of course, they're contrary to the will of God. By the way, you try to live your life as a Christian. Don't take this as a question to you, not that I approve of this. All right. Say it again. It describes the desires of worldly pleasure that are contrary, of course, to the will of God. And by the way, it's always used in the New Testament in a bad sense. It belongs to an unsanctified carnality. It's a bad word. It's the word that means evil pleasures, desire for evil. Hedon, the Greek word, expresses the yearnings of self-love. It's perhaps as well defined as anywhere as in 2 Timothy 3 and verse 4, which I mentioned earlier, men who are lovers of pleasure more than they that are lovers of God. Hey, what are you going to do tonight? I don't feel like going to church. Huh. All right. When you're feeling sick, will you go to a doctor? Oh, definitely. When you're having a spiritual problem, what are you going to do? Just stay home and hang around and do nothing? Listen, you be careful. Like I said, 1 Timothy 3:4 defines people who are lovers of pleasure more than lovers of God. It means to be consumed with pleasure. The unrighteous man is a slave to his desires. You understand that? He's a slave to those desires. Listen, it's a frightening slavery. And believe me, passion is a cruel master. And even though the Surgeon General and everybody else says the things that they say you're going to use are not completely effective, but people are going to do it anyway. And we could stand up here, Chad could stand up here and preach his Sunday school lesson. At other times, really pitch in and help with when I can't be here. But it's for a purpose. And the purpose is that we would learn what we ought to do and what we ought not to do. So God's people say, amen. You take your prayer sheet tonight. Let me mention something to you, and then open it for prayer request. I'm not sure the date that this took place, but Mrs. Cropsey has gone home to be with the Lord. I think all the years that I've known Mr. Cropsey and his wife, and they moved down to South Carolina, living down there. And of course, their children are scattered all across the world,